10 years ago, I would have walked past the lamppost without a second glance. The city record said the line of cast-iron gas lamps on Königstrasse was installed in 1889, when the district was modernized with piped gas. The engineering journal from that year published a neat elevation, a simple, fluted column, standard Victorian ornament, nothing unusual. That is what I expected to find when I stood there one winter afternoon, archive print in hand, camera in the other. What I found instead was a base precisely machined like modern CNC work, bolts seated in stone blocks older than the building behind them, and a sealed access panel matching diagrams from Tartarian infrastructure studies. Alternative researchers call these Tartarian gas systems. I had called them speculation. Standing there, I realized the official drawing and the physical iron did not match. I also realized I would not be sleeping well for a while. I returned to Königstrasse that same evening, when traffic had thinned, and the gas lamps, now electrified but housed in original iron shells, cast long shadows across worn pavement. The city archive note was specific. Gas lighting installed 1889 under municipal engineer Karl Hoffmann. A sepia photograph showed workmen beside freshly set lamp standards, the street behind them unpaved. That photograph convinced me this would be simple research, ordinary Victorian street furniture, documented installation, nothing more to investigate. But standing at the first lamp, I noticed what the photograph omitted. The stone plinth beneath the iron column was visibly older than the building facade behind it, older by decades, perhaps longer. The limestone bore tooling marks suggesting pre-industrial stone dressing, patient chisel work seen on medieval foundations, not 1880s municipal projects. Yet the mounting plate was machined with extraordinary precision. Perfectly centered bolts sat in an octagonal pattern, each hole drilled with tolerances challenging modern equipment. The spacing between bolts was identical to within fractions of a millimeter. This was not Victorian craftsmanship using hand tools. This was something else. I crouched and ran my fingers along the base. That was when I found what official drawings omitted. The faint outline of a sealed panel at waist height, exactly where a regulator chamber would sit in Tartarian infrastructure diagrams I had dismissed years earlier. The panel had been bricked up from inside, plastered smooth, painted to match, but seams remained visible if you knew where to look. My notebook ended with one line. The official drawing shows a simple lamp. The physical structure shows something else entirely. Back in the municipal archive reading room, surrounded by musty paper smell and distant city sounds, I requested the complete gas lighting file, contracts, specifications, supplier correspondence. The archivist brought 3 heavy boxes covering the entire period of gas infrastructure development. Everything was remarkably in order, pipe diameters specified to the centimeter with pressure calculations, trench depths following standard practice, supplier names matching known foundries with invoices preserved chronologically. The documentation was thorough, professional, exactly what one would expect from a well-administered German municipality. The lamps themselves were catalogued simply as Type B, ornamental standard, with no further detail anywhere in 3 boxes. That phrase appeared repeatedly, on contracts, schedules, maintenance logs, but never with elaboration. Type B, ornamental standard, as if those 4 words explained everything. I searched for engineering drawings of lamp bases. Files contained meticulous specifications for underground pipes, valve placements, junction boxes. For lamp standards visible above ground, the most prominent elements, there was only a generic silhouette from a supplier catalogue, no dimensions for the base, no explanation of the octagonal bolt pattern, no mention of access panels or stone plinths. An engineering journal from the same year reproduced that simplified profile. The drawing was deliberately imprecise where base met foundation, lines fading into cross-hatching as if the illustrator was instructed to leave that section vague. Every other element was rendered in crisp detail. Only the base remained obscured. On my notebook margin, I sketched the lamp base as measured, then compared it to a plate from a Russian atlas where regions were labeled Tartaria. Alternative researchers have drawn connections between that label and these over-engineered bases. The proportions were disturbingly similar. Bolt patterns appeared to match. The last page was a renovation order from 1927. Removal of underground mechanisms of unknown purpose beneath selected lamp standards, chambers to be filled with concrete and sealed permanently, no salvage required, no diagrams attached, no photographs, no explanation of what mechanisms of unknown purpose meant. I closed the file and sat in fading afternoon light. Somewhere beneath streets I had walked, chambers had been filled with concrete 90 years ago. Whatever they contained was now permanently inaccessible and apparently permanently undocumented. I returned to Königstrasse on a clear Saturday with proper equipment: surveyor's tape, laser level, camera, notebook, full of questions. The street was busy with shoppers, none paying attention to the man crouching beside lamp posts. The lamp bases formed a perfectly straight line over 430 meters. I measured the full length twice to confirm. Spacing between each lamp was identical to within 3 millimeters over the entire distance, despite more than a century of ground subsidence, road repairs, utility excavations, and building reconstruction. 3 millimeters across 400 meters. The precision was extraordinary. The street had been realigned twice according to planning records. Once in 1912 for tram lines when the roadbed was widened. Again in 1961 for automobiles when cobblestones were replaced with asphalt. Both realignments shifted the street's center line. Neither moved the lamp line. The road had bent around fixed points that apparently could not be relocated. Each lamp base sat on a stone cube far larger than necessary for anchoring a hollow iron column. I estimated each cube at over 1,500 kilograms. The columns weighed perhaps 200. The ratio was absurd. Foundations 7 times heavier than structures they supported. Victorian engineers were practical people who did not waste money on unnecessary materials. The iron casting showed almost no pitting or corrosion compared to nearby railings from the same period. Those showed expected weathering, surface rust, minor pitting, general degradation from a century of exposure. The lamp bases looked almost new. Whatever alloy was used, whatever surface treatment applied, it was not standard Victorian cast iron. In Tartarian forums, contributors discuss power corridors, linear alignments of posts supposedly routing energy across landscapes. I had filed this under pattern seeking, human tendency to find meaning in coincidence. But the Königstrasse alignment looked uncomfortably close to their diagrams, spacing too exact for hand measurement over uneven ground, materials too durable for period manufacturing, scale too large for apparent function. According to official records, the street was straightened in the 1880s for tram lines, and lamps were subsequently installed. My measurements suggested the reverse. At 2 points, original tram rails, still visible beneath modern paving, bent gently to avoid the lamp line. The lamps had not been positioned to follow trams. The trams had been routed around lamps already there. My notes ended with one sentence, underlined twice. The city claims lamps followed the street. The maps suggest the street followed the lamps. Following the lamp line inland from Königstrasse, I traced its path through the old commercial district until it terminated at a 19th century hotel officially opened in 1892. The building had been renovated several times, converted to apartments in the 20s, damaged by bombing in 44, rebuilt in the 60s, but retained its original limestone facade and ornate ironwork. The hotel offered public tours of its lower levels on weekends. I joined one on a rainy Sunday, following visitors through narrow basement passages while a guide explained the building's history. The tour passed through the original coal storage area, the former boiler room, now wine storage, and service corridors connecting the kitchen to other areas. In one corridor, while the guide explained the heating system, I noticed something she did not mention. Behind wine bottles and beneath layers of whitewash, there was a blocked arch in the foundation wall. The arch was perhaps 2 meters wide and 1.5 tall, large enough for a person to pass through or equipment to be moved. More significantly, it was aligned precisely with the last lamp on Königstrasse outside. I checked my compass twice. I lingered while the group moved ahead. The blocking material was modern brick, not period stone. The mortar was 20th century cement, not lime mortar from original construction. This arch had been open when the hotel was built. It had been sealed later, within the last century, based on materials. The hotel's original plans, which I obtained from the planning office days later, showed coal storage and a boiler room. They did not show this arch. A renovation plan from 1961 marked the location with a typed notation, filled cavity. No dimensions, no explanation of what the cavity had been. What struck me most was the arch's sill. Visible through a gap in whitewash, the stone showed mineral staining consistent with prolonged exposure to flowing water or pressurized fluids. Deposits formed layered patterns that develop around pipes and channels over decades of use. This was not simply a doorway closed, it looked like it once held active infrastructure. Some Tartarian researchers argue grand hotels were built over existing nodes in an older infrastructure network. Positioned to access systems the new builders did not fully understand but recognized as valuable. Standing in that basement with my hand on cold infill brick, I began understanding why such ideas persist. Something had once moved behind this wall, pressure, fluid, perhaps gas. The hotel was built around it and then sealed it permanently away. Over the following months, I collected photographs of similar historic gas lamps from other European cities, Vienna, Prague, St. Petersburg, Brussels, Budapest. I looked for images of lamps officially dated to the 1880s or 90s, particularly those on bases appearing older than the streets themselves. The results were troubling in their consistency. An engineering journal from 1875 published a plate titled Modern Gas Standards in Principal European Capitals. Drawings showed lamp columns with careful attention to decorative details, fluted shafts, ornamental brackets, glass housings. But base sections were deliberately vague, fading into crosshatching where lamp met foundation. Every illustration followed this pattern: precision above, ambiguity below. I began mapping the impossibilities. Symmetry. Identical bolt circles and access panel placements appeared in cities with different suppliers, foundries, and administrations separated by hundreds of kilometers. The octagonal pattern from Königstrasse appeared in Vienna. The same sealed panel proportions showed up in Prague and Budapest. Scale foundations were consistently oversized relative to documented gas pressures, far more massive than necessary for hollow columns. Material, recurring motifs and surface finishes appeared across the continent, requiring standardized production in an era when such coordination did not exist. I overlaid my collection onto a historical map where Great Tartary still appeared as a geographical designation, a label on European maps from the 16th through 19th centuries before being replaced by specific political boundaries. The densest clusters of anomalous lamp bases fell either within that boundary or along trade routes connecting Tartarian territories to European ports. I cannot prove causation, from correlation. Two things occupying similar spaces does not mean they are connected, but the pattern was becoming difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A city plan of St. Petersburg from 1870 included lamppost icons along Nevsky Prospect decades before official gas installation records for that street. The legend offered no explanation. Either the cartographer anticipated future infrastructure with remarkable precision, or the infrastructure already existed under a different name and was later connected to the gas network and relabeled as municipal achievement. I contacted archives of gas companies that supposedly installed these systems. Their responses revealed a consistent pattern of detailed documentation in some areas and complete silence in others. Company ledgers were remarkably thorough about certain matters: miles of pipe laid each year, consumers connected, coal processed, quarterly profit and loss statements. Victorian gas companies were meticulous financial record keepers because investors demanded accountability. They were notably vague about infrastructure specifics above ground. There were no factory photographs of lamp standards being cast or assembled, despite abundant imagery of retort houses, gas holders being constructed, workers posing beside equipment. The companies documented production facilities exhaustively. But for the most publicly visible elements, the actual lamps customers saw, there was almost nothing. The lamps appeared fully formed on streets in period photographs, never in production. No foundry tours captured the casting process. No assembly areas showed workers fitting components. It was as if the lamps materialized from sources no one thought worth documenting. Alternative researchers point out that genuinely new infrastructure tends to be documented obsessively. When companies build something innovative, they photograph every stage. If these lamps were partially inherited, if companies connected existing pillars to new mains rather than manufacturing complete units, documentation would naturally be thinner. They were billing for connections, not creation. I do not endorse that conclusion, but I observe the asymmetry. Detailed invoices for every meter of underground pipe. Silence around the nodes meeting public space. A maintenance log from 1883 included a routine entry: connecting existing pillar to new gas main at corner of Friedrichstrasse. Standard fitting required modification to match older threading pattern. Existing pillar, older threading pattern. The notation was buried among dozens of similar entries, written matter-of-factly. If pillars existed before gas mains were installed, what were they originally for? What threading pattern had they used? Why did it not match 1883 fittings? The log offered no answers. Neither did company archives. Neither did anyone I could find who had researched this infrastructure before me. In a Central European city whose Heritage Office requested anonymity as a condition of research access, I was permitted to examine original photographs of a grand public square taken before and after what municipal records called comprehensive modernization during the 1870s. The archive had preserved these images carefully, recognizing their historical value even if no one had thought to ask the questions they raised. The transformation documented in these photographs was subtle but unmistakable once you trained your eye to observe specific details rather than general impressions of Victorian urban improvement. In the earlier images, dating from approximately 1865 based on the photographic technology employed and the paper stock used for prints, monumental lampposts stood on ornate stone plinths around the square's perimeter. The plinths featured clearly visible inspection hatches, substantial iron panels with heavy hinges and industrial locking mechanisms, obviously designed for regular access by maintenance personnel rather than mere decoration. These hatches were not small or inconspicuous details that might escape notice. They measured perhaps half a meter on each side, positioned at comfortable working height on each plinth. With robust hardware indicating frequent use, by workers who needed reliable access to whatever lay beneath the street surface. In photographs from the 1890s, taken from nearly identical vantage points and showing the same lamp posts standing in precisely the same positions around the same square, a crucial change had occurred that required careful comparison to notice. The inspection hatches had vanished completely from every single plinth. They had been covered over with iron panels welded or heavily bolted into permanent position, then carefully painted to match the surrounding decorative metalwork so seamlessly that casual observers would never suspect anything had been modified. The work was professionally executed, nearly invisible unless you were specifically comparing before and after images with focused attention to this particular architectural detail. Someone with authority had decided at some point between these two sets of photographs that whatever those hatches provided access to was no longer needed by maintenance workers, or, perhaps more significantly, was no longer wanted to be accessible to anyone at all under any circumstances. The question that haunted me was simple: what had changed, and why had the change required such thorough concealment? A period engineering journal article discussing drainage improvements in this same square, published in 1872 and preserved in the city's technical library, described encountering unexpected vaulted chambers of considerable extent during excavation for new sewer lines beneath the pavement. Some of these chambers, the article noted with apparent satisfaction at the cost savings involved, had been successfully repurposed for modern gas distribution conduits, while others were deemed unsuitable for integration with modern municipal systems and accordingly filled with rubble and aggregate material. The dimensions provided for these underground chambers were substantial and surprisingly precise, approximately 3 meters in diameter, extending 4 to 6 meters below current street level, constructed of carefully dressed stone blocks with vaulted or domed ceilings that had survived completely intact despite unknown centuries of existence underground. Those specific dimensions and construction details matched almost exactly the structures that Tartarian infrastructure researchers associate with what they term pressure domes, underground chambers supposedly engineered to regulate fluid or gas flows across significant distances in a pre-industrial distribution network. The mainstream engineering interpretation would classify these simply as old cisterns for water storage, medieval storage vaults, or remnants of earlier drainage systems, subsequently repurposed by practical-minded Victorian builders who wasted nothing useful. But cisterns and storage vaults do not typically require the kind of regular maintenance access suggested by those prominent hinged panels with their heavy-duty industrial hardware, nor do they typically feature the sophisticated domed construction methods described so precisely in the engineering article. I visited the modern incarnation of this historic square on a grey November afternoon, walking slowly and systematically around its full perimeter, while tourists photographed a seasonal holiday market and vendors sold mulled wine from temporary wooden stalls. Near each location where historic lampposts had stood according to the old photographs, I found exactly what I had learned to look for during months of similar investigations: patched circular scars in the granite paving stones, roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, where something had once penetrated vertically through the pavement surface, but had since been filled with modern cement and worn relatively smooth by decades of foot traffic. And the patches were clearly old, several decades at minimum, but remained visible as slightly different coloured circles against the surrounding grey stone if you knew to look down at the ground rather than around at the architecture. The spacing of these filled penetrations matched precisely the underground chamber layout described in the 1872 engineering article. Whatever physical connection had once linked the surface lampposts to the vaulted chambers discovered below had been systematically severed and covered over at some point, leaving only these subtle traces for researchers patient enough to look for patterns in mundane pavement repairs. One archival quote from a municipal engineer's progress report remained with me long after I departed that city. Existing subterranean arrangements of considerable antiquity and unknown original purpose presented both opportunity for significant cost savings and difficulty for modern integration to the drainage works. Opportunity because pre-existing chambers could be repurposed rather than constructed new at great expense. Difficulty because no one knew with any certainty who had originally built them when they had been constructed or what specific function they had served. The engineer's report continued for many pages with drainage calculations and cost projections. It never once returned to the question of the chamber's origins. The mystery had been noted and permanently set aside as someone else's problem. In a late 19th century fire insurance map of a major German industrial city, preserved in a regional archive I visited during my 6th month of investigation, I discovered an anomaly I could not explain through any conventional historical framework. Fire insurance maps from this period were extraordinarily detailed documents produced by specialized commercial companies to assess risk accurately for underwriters. Every building was systematically catalogued by primary construction material, total height, and current use. Every potential source of fire risk was carefully marked, including proximity to gas infrastructure, since gas leaks represented significant conflagration dangers. Each street lamp appeared as a small, standardized symbol, since gas-fueled lamps represented both direct fire risk and useful navigational reference for firefighting crews responding to emergencies. On one particular sheet covering a residential district in the city's expanding eastern suburbs, a ring of lamp symbols encircled a city block that, according to all other municipal records, was still largely undeveloped empty land at the time this survey was conducted. The map bore a clear date of 1882. Land registry documents showed the first building permits for that specific block were not issued until 1889, fully 7 years after the insurance map was drawn. The buildings came 7 years after the map was completed. Yet the lamps were already clearly marked there, forming a near-perfect geometric circle when the insurance company's surveyors documented the area. City Council minutes from 1885, 3 years after the map but 4 years before any buildings, described the municipal council officially approving gas lighting for the new residential quarter under development, presenting this as forward-thinking urban planning. But the fire insurance map dated from 3 years before that council approval, and the lamps it showed formed a precise geometric pattern completely unrelated to any proposed street layout I could find in planning archives. The documented lamps did not follow a street plan that would not be finalized for years. They did not follow any visible natural feature or legal property boundary. They formed a circle, a near-perfect geometric circle, with a radius I calculated at 47 meters when measured from the scaled map reproduction. That specific radius corresponded, within reasonable measurement error, to similar lamp rings I had found documented in entirely different records from another city over 800 kilometers away. 2 separate circles of identical geometry in different countries, created by different municipal authorities in different decades, with no documented communication between them, yet displaying geometric proportions matching to within a meter or two. The statistical odds of such independent convergence of 2 separate cities accidentally creating identical geometric patterns without coordination were vanishingly small. Some alternative researchers argue that these lamp alignments trace pre-existing grid lines of Tartarian infrastructure, geometric patterns established by an earlier civilization that later urban planners unknowingly followed. According to this interpretation, the infrastructure came first. Modern cities grew around fixed points whose original purpose had been forgotten. The theory sounds like fantasy when summarized briefly. But the documented sequencing, lamps clearly present before buildings existed, precise geometry established before planning committees convened, supported the chronological aspect of that narrative with uncomfortable clarity. At the very edge of the map sheet, nearly illegible in the microfilm reproduction, was a small, handwritten annotation. Old pillars, retained per Municipal Directive 1871. No further explanation was provided. The surveyor had noted the pillars' presence, attributed their retention to a municipal decision predating his survey by over a decade, and moved on without questioning why pillars predating the entire neighborhood existed in such precise geometric arrangement. That reference directive from 1871, 11 years before the map, 18 years before the first building permits, might have answered many questions. I searched municipal archives systematically for 3 weeks without finding any trace of it. The directive was referenced but never reproduced, cited but never preserved. As I traced the documented history of these lamp systems through the 20th century, examining renovation records from multiple cities across several decades of urban transformation, a remarkably consistent pattern of systematic alteration emerged from the dry, bureaucratic language of municipal engineering departments. The same administrative phrases appeared repeatedly in official documents, separated by years and hundreds of kilometers, as if drawn from some common template. Removal of redundant underground chambers, filling of obsolete service pits, simplification of underground utility works, permanent sealing of lower apparatus, elimination of unnecessary access points. The language was deliberately routine, designed to make dramatic, irreversible changes sound like minor housekeeping. But the consistency across such distances and time spans was deeply suspicious. From Berlin to Vienna to Prague to Budapest, the same categories of modification occurred within roughly the same decades, employing nearly identical justifications and procedures. Photographic evidence powerfully reinforced this pattern. Early photographs from the 1880s and 90s consistently showed lampposts with ornate, complex bases featuring vent-like cutouts that may have served functional purposes, accessible panels with visible hinges and locks designed for regular entry, and substantial plinths suggesting significant infrastructure beneath. Later photographs from the 1920s and 30s revealed dramatically simplified designs, the same columns in the same positions, but with lower sections permanently encased in concrete, buried deeper beneath raised pavement, or replaced entirely with utilitarian poles, serving only to support lights. Whatever infrastructure had required regular access in 1890 evidently no longer did by 1930, or perhaps more accurately, access was no longer permitted to anyone. Within Tartarian research communities, such systematic alterations are cited as evidence of deliberate erasure, coordinated effort by authorities to eliminate traces of systems whose existence would challenge official narratives. From a conventional engineering standpoint, the same modifications could be explained as safety upgrades, closing access points against vandalism, filling chambers that became structurally unsafe, replacing equipment requiring specialized maintenance. Both frameworks fit documented evidence. Neither can be definitively proven, but the consistency troubled me profoundly. These were not isolated decisions by individual engineers responding to local conditions. They were coordinated patterns occurring throughout an entire region over generations, using similar techniques, similar language, similar timelines. If each city had independently decided to seal lamp infrastructure, we would expect considerable variation in methods and timing. What I found instead was standardization across political and linguistic boundaries, as if someone had distributed guidelines that everyone followed without question. One maintenance work order from 1929 stood out among hundreds of routine documents. Removed, unidentified iron apparatus beneath pillar at corner of Market Street per standing departmental order, 1923-47. Apparatus consisted of valve mechanism, pressure regulation gauge, and pipe connections of unfamiliar manufacture not matching any current municipal specifications. No record of original installation date or purpose found in any available archive, despite thorough search. Filled resulting cavity with structural concrete per standard procedure. Removed components disposed of as scrap metal without preservation. The worker who wrote that notation did not understand what he was removing. No supervisor explained its significance. No one instructed him to photograph, measure, or preserve any part for historical study. He followed standing orders issued 6 years earlier, documented the removal in one paragraph, arranged for the components to be melted as anonymous scrap, and moved on to his next task. I ended my research notes with a question that kept me awake. If the apparatus was truly obsolete as claimed, why no institutional curiosity about its origins? Why no drawing, no photograph, no preservation of even one example? Why standing orders requiring disposal rather than study? Why only silence and concrete where obvious questions should have been asked? In a coastal city along the Baltic Sea, I examined a 19th-century hotel promenade where elegant wrought-iron lamps line a substantial stone seawall constructed during the 1870s. The lamps were undeniably elegant, identical in basic design to gaslighting fixtures found throughout European cities. Official heritage documentation classified them as period gas lighting, restored, and dated their installation to 1878. But, according to detailed renovation reports I obtained from municipal engineering archives, several of these promenade lamps were never actually connected to gas service at any point in their documented existence. Not disconnected at some later date, never connected in the first place, despite their obvious design as gas lamp fixtures. Instead, they sat atop vertical shafts of considerable depth, leading to what documents described only as ancient drainage infrastructure of indeterminate origin. I arranged a formal site visit with the city's Heritage Preservation Office, presenting myself as an independent researcher studying Victorian municipal engineering. The preservation officer was helpful and curious about my interest in what he considered minor technical details. He arranged access to one shaft opening, normally sealed with a heavy cast-iron grate bolted to surrounding stonework. Standing above the open shaft on a grey October morning, with cold sea wind cutting across the promenade, I experienced something no document had prepared me for. A faint but unmistakably steady updraft of cool air rising continuously from somewhere deep below. The shaft descended into complete darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The airflow was constant, not variable with surface conditions, suggesting sustained pressure differential between whatever underground space existed below and surface atmosphere, exactly what you would expect from an active ventilation system, not passive drainage that merely channeled rainwater downward. The vertical shafts were evenly spaced along the curving seawall regardless of the wall's angles and curves around rocky outcroppings, maintaining mathematically consistent intervals even where the promenade bent significantly to follow the coastline. This precise spacing regardless of surface features suggested the shafts predated the wall's construction and were incorporated into later design as fixed points that could not be relocated. The cast-iron collars at each opening showed machining quality I had learned to recognize, tolerances more typical of industrial steam-fitting work than decorative street furniture. Tartarian researchers have long proposed that many lamps in coastal locations were actually repurposed atmospheric vents for an earlier distribution system, decorative Victorian housings added later to disguise functional infrastructure that authorities either did not understand or could not explain to citizens without raising uncomfortable questions. Mainstream history acknowledges that earlier civilizations built sophisticated underground infrastructure we still use. Roman sewers functioning after 2 millennia, medieval aqueducts channeling water through ancient stone. We accept without controversy that earlier generations possessed engineering capabilities whose products we inherit. Yet here, an obviously engineered active airflow system, deep galleries, precisely machined fittings, a steady pressure differential maintained after more than a century, was described in all official documents only as drainage without further investigation. Deep in one shaft, barely visible even with powerful light, I made out a heavily corroded valve wheel mounted on a substantial pipe curving away into darkness. The wheel was substantial, 40 centimeters diameter, designed to control significant flow. A rope ladder that once provided access had been removed. Only rusted mounting brackets remained, testament to a time when workers routinely descended to service whatever system this valve controlled. Whatever that valve regulated was now permanently beyond reach. Whatever system it served had been sealed away and written out of official records as mere drainage, unworthy of documentation. I spread accumulated evidence across my desk, photographs from hotels in Germany, railway stations in Britain, promenades along the Black Sea, buildings in cities once within boundaries labelled Tartarian on 18th century maps. Each location featured the same family of lamppost bases, oversized stone plinths, octagonal bolt patterns with identical spacing, sealed access panels at consistent heights. The materials showed the same anomalous durability I had first observed on Königstrasse: iron that had not corroded as expected, stone that had not weathered as it should. Beneath them, records from different cities and eras consistently mentioned chambers and apparatus of unknown origin filled, sealed, or destroyed during modernization. I created comparison charts, symmetry, repeating geometries appeared across continents, maintaining consistency requiring either impossible coordination between 19th century authorities or a common template predating all documented construction. Scale: foundations consistently 5 to 10 times heavier than structures they supported, with no engineering rationale. Material: identical alloys and surface treatments appeared in samples separated by oceans before international metallurgical standards existed. When I overlaid anomaly locations onto historical maps where Great Tartary appeared as geographical designation, the correlation was impossible to ignore. Densest clusters sat either within that historical boundary or along trade routes connecting Tartarian territories to European ports. This does not prove causation. Geographic correlation is not causation. Two phenomena occupying overlapping spaces does not demonstrate common origin, but random distribution would not produce this pattern. Something caused these structures to cluster where they cluster and share the features they share. I stressed in my notes that Tartaria as unified empire remains unproven, hypothesis, not fact. The geographical term was applied imprecisely by European map-makers who understood little about Asia's interior. Yet the built environment suggested some pre-industrial, trans-regional engineering culture may have existed, something producing standardized infrastructure across vast distances whose traces were overwritten as successive authorities claimed inherited systems as their own. A digital composite I assembled showed lamp bases from 6 countries layered into near-perfect alignment. Bolt patterns matched. Proportions matched. Sealed panels occupied the same positions. Whatever built these knew exactly what it was doing, and did it everywhere. I shifted from examining what records showed to understanding how records disappear. Gas companies kept meticulous financial documentation because capital demanded accountability. Every pipe required an invoice. Every connection generated billing records. Ledgers were comprehensive because money was at stake. but features predating company operations had no place in accounting systems. No line item for existing pillars reused. No category for chambers of unknown purpose integrated into network. When a pre-existing pillar connected to a new main, it became our installation in corporate reports. Whatever previous function it served became invisible in accounting. The erasure was not conspiratorial, institutional indifference to anything not affecting balance sheets. That indifference is precisely the mechanism causing evidence of inherited infrastructure to vanish, not active suppression but bureaucratic systems documenting only what they create and own. I found myself between two unsatisfying positions. Mainstream narrative contained glaring gaps, precision exceeding documented capabilities, chambers sealed without explanation, global consistency defying 19th century constraints. Tartarian narrative filled gaps with speculation, but speculation is not evidence, and absence of conventional explanation does not validate unconventional ones. The lamps stood either way. Sealed chambers remained sealed. Photographs showed what they showed, regardless of interpretation. A final archival note from a 1970s renewal project captured the end point of this process. All remaining historic lamp pillars removed per renewal plan, foundations excavated to 2 meters depth, cavities filled with structural concrete, modern aluminum lighting installed, no historical salvage required or performed. Centuries of inherited infrastructure, whatever it was, whoever built it, whatever purpose it served, reduced to debris and buried because no one saw value in asking where it came from. I returned to Königstrasse on a cold January evening, almost exactly 1 year after my first visit. The street was quiet, shops closed, lampposts casting the same steady glow they had cast for over a century under various power sources. I stood beside the original lamp whose sealed panel had started this investigation. The iron housing was unchanged, perhaps darker from another year of grime. The stone plinth still bore tooling marks from an era predating the building behind it. Bolts still sat in octagonal pattern, machined to tolerances challenging the official 1889 construction date. I knelt and ran my hand over the sealed access panel, feeling faint seams beneath paint where a door once provided entry to something below. The outline remained visible. A rectangle of different texture, ghost of hinges removed, shadow of function denied. The lamp line stretched into winter darkness, perfectly straight after more than a century. Plinths massively oversized. Iron anomalously resistant to corrosion, symmetry too precise for hand measurement and period installation methods. I thought of maps where Tartaria was replaced by other names as borders shifted and older knowledge was forgotten. Renovation orders where existing pillars became redundant apparatus, and finally removed objects without anyone recording what those objects had been. Chambers filled by workers following orders they did not understand. Valve wheels in darkened shafts, forever out of reach. I do not claim proof of ancient Tartarian gas lamps. The evidence does not support proof, it supports questions. What I have is a pattern, inherited infrastructure attributed to later builders, over-engineered furniture exceeding documented purpose, sealed chambers destroyed without documentation, records beginning just after the moment they would need to describe origins. And the gap in documentation is always in the same place, the transition between what existed before and what was supposedly built new. That gap is where Tartaria hides, if it exists, in silence, between ancient stone and official ledgers, in concrete filling chambers no one photographed, in standing orders no one questioned. The lamp stood in darkness, iron cold against my palm, sealed panel barely visible in streetlight, not speaking, not explaining, simply remaining where a forgotten system once touched the surface of the world, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and refuse convenient silence as answer. Whatever built these knew something we have lost. Whatever sealed them wanted that knowledge lost. The evidence suggests they nearly succeeded.